So, this is interesting. Got a new computer. It's a good old laptop with what seems to be a pretty decent camera. But the funny thing is, the lens on it is a lot wider than what I'm used to, and basically any angle that I sit at, it's got my company logo right there. So I liked the plain blue backdrop, but we can't do it. Um, so this is kind of just a test. I'm gonna see how the audio is, and then we'll see if I post it, if I decide to. Yeah. So we're gonna talk about something that I briefly touched on in the last video. Um, we're gonna go real basic. Just lay out a basic framework of why every time I'm talking about this shit, I always say, but metal is an exception. Metalheads are an exception, right? I come from a background of listening to a lot of metal, but when I'm talking about music in general, I'm almost always approaching it from not metal and then treating that genre and that fan base as an exception. And from my view of it, there's a number of reasons why that I'm just going to go over in no particular order. Um, the big thing that I talked about last video was this idea that people who are drawn to metal are listening to music for a different reason than normal people. In a lot of cases, this idea that the musicianship and the technicality is forefront to necessarily the feel or the vibe of a song. Because to normal people, metal is always going to feel angry and aggressive. You've got this big wall of distorted sound. That's what it feels like. And so people who seek out this sort of thing, they're going into it because of this level of technicality and musicianship. So one of the reasons I feel that metal can be really gatekeepy is because there is a certain bar for entry in understanding metal because it is loud, it is distorted, everything is distorted. Even like your normal conservative-ish metal mix is going to be way louder feeling and way harsher than basically any other genre out there. Um, and it's an acquired taste. And people who say it isn't, sure. I mean, if you grew up with your dad blasting heavy metal, then sure, maybe you've just listened to it since you were a kid. But like for normal people, you have to have repeated exposure. You might be instantly drawn to like the angst of it, of like a Linkin Park or even like one of Slipknot's more radio friendly songs, but nobody just spun Cannibal Corpse and was like, yes, this is it. No more listening to the radio. I'm now listening to this. Like, no. It's an acquired taste. And it's because everything is so loud and aggressive, you as the listener have to actively pick a lot of things out in a way that isn't true with other genres. A lot of genres, particularly pop music, they kind of spoon feed you everything. You don't have to pick through this kind of wall of sound. And this isn't the only genre that's like that. Listen to Cyclone 9. like industrial and a lot of the more like, experimental genres that I don't really listen to too much. It can also feel like that. Listening to Cyclone 9 album, it's just a wall of noise, and not in the way that I understand it. It's not in the metal way. There's metal elements, but every single facet of that music is distorted in a different way. And like, I like it, but I don't know what the fuck is going on, like at any point. I just know that I like it, and I think that that's how most people feel when listening to music. So there's a certain level of work you have to put in to get out of metal what normal people get out of more typical genres of music, like your pop and your country and even your more mainstream rap. With those, you can put them on and you just get it. You have one listen to someone you've never heard before, and there's a good chance you're going to click with it. Whereas if you've never heard anything of the specific metal genre that you're checking out, you're probably not going to instantly like it unless it's very similar to something else, because your brain has to work through getting through these layers of distortion, these like really harsh pounding drums that are constant that sound like fucking robots, and then the super super distorted guitars. Like, you have to know how to unhear what a high gain amp is doing to playing before you can even understand what they're playing, right? That's why, like, if you're not really a music person, it's so crazy that guitarists can hear something and pick out what they're doing when it's just like, it's just fucking noise, right? And I realized it took me playing a lot of guitar through a high gain amp to get it, because the notes that you're hearing don't sound like normal notes. If you played a guitar, like a crazy metal riff on piano, it sounds nothing. The notes don't even sound the same, because there's so much gain. It has to do with overtones and the way that the amp is distorting the guitar signal. And same with the vocals, of course. Vocals are screamed, and you're not listening to it for a melody, right? I've had a few talks recently about how the vocalist in a death metal band is the percussionist, because the drums are too fast and complicated for everyone to understand, right? And like a normal person, they're not going to click with that right away. So anyway, that's one of the big points, is like, there's a bar for entry there for putting in work to understanding the music itself. And then I'm sure you get lots out of it, right? Because then you start to pick through the song structure, the riffs, the composition, how these parts are working together. And it's hugely rewarding, of course. Another thing similar to that is, I mentioned the technicality, right? And I've mentioned before this base level of technicality for metal, because to be a pop musician, well, to be a pop singer, I would say, and arguably, I guess, like a singer-songwriter, like, you can rip off Taylor Swift and just sing with an acoustic guitar, and you have to have a decent voice, and you have to have a decent range, and you have to get your chords down, right? But that's basically it. You can play bars and whatever, and you can become popular. That's fine. With metal, almost every genre has this base level of technical musical ability on an instrumental ability, that's way higher than most other genres. Like, your run of the mill average, just sort of blindfold throw a dart at a metal song, is going to require so much more practice in terms of speed and probably drilling scales and shit like that than any other genre or any other like normal people listening to genre, right? Especially in the drums, but the guitars as well, and even the bass, and of course the vocals are a whole different thing. Um, there's that level there of, when I'm talking about musicianship, I have to add specifically that metal is different because of that sort of baseline kind of technicality thing. A lot of people, if you know your way around a guitar, you've been playing guitar for a few years, you can pick up and play music by a lot of bands. Like, not every band. Some of them are really complicated. Some of them are stupid easy, right? If you're comparing like Muse or Red Hot Chili Peppers to Green Day, you're gonna notice a difference, and that's not better or worse. That's just different. But you know, you playing a few years of guitar, pick up basically any metal song, unless it's Doom, and you're gonna have a fucking time. Technical ability is sort of an inherent gatekeeper of metal, because you kind of have to practice your ass off when you're starting out just to get at the level that like a generic normal band is, right? Which again also contributes to the gatekeepy shit. We're gonna keep coming back to that, because metalheads, they fucking love to gatekeep, and I'm trying to dissect exactly why. But that'll be it too, is that like, I've known people like this who, you know, incredibly talented guitar players, bass player, what have you, and they practice their fucking ass off, and they're super, super technical. And because of that, because they put so much time into their craft, they expect that they deserve to be successful, which again, I've talked about, right? And I think that they take it personally when they see John Green Day from Green Day go up, and it's like, oh, he only knows three chords. It's like, okay, he probably knows a little bit more guitar than three chords, but I don't fucking know. I've never met him. And I feel like they take it personally when these bands sell out stadiums playing very technically simplistic music because they almost have to admit that there's more to music than shredding, right? And I've met people like that. And I think that that's where that lies with them is that, like, oh, I wasted all this time and we're still not popular. It's almost like you don't need shredding to be popular. But in metal, it certainly doesn't hurt. And that's one of the other sort of strange things that you don't really find in other genres. And I want to come back and say, like, metal isn't the only genre of music that focuses on musicianship and technicality, right? I think a lot of people listening to jazz aren't really listening to it for the lyrics. All of the people who are famous jazz musicians, or most of them, they're instrumentalists. They're not singers, with the exception of like Stevie Wonder, but he also played piano, I think. I'm not a jazzman, but like all the big names you hear, like Coltrane and like who else? Duke Ellington, like they're instrumentalists. I'm pretty sure. Again, not an expert. Um, so that's not to say metal is the only genre like that, but definitely in the I'm just going to turn on the radio and listen to some music, you're not necessarily going to hear extremely technical music. That's not the focus. The focus is on the feel, the focus is on the lyrics, the focus is on dumbing it down to a point where any random piece of shit turning on the radio is going to be like, oh, I don't feel alienated by this. And sometimes it seems like metal's explicit intent is to alienate people. It depends on the subgenre. We're just talking like blanket. Um, and I do feel in a lot of things, like when I say like doom, because doom is not a technical genre, and it also doesn't really feel like metal in a lot of ways. Like people who just like rock. So, for example, my wife hates metal, lol. And she made a playlist of all the metal that she doesn't hate, and it's literally all doom and sludge. And it's like, yeah, that kind of tracks because it doesn't have many of the trademarks of metal, like when you, as you would typically think of it. And I thought that was interesting. So that's another one. It's just this baseline level of technicality, and that combined with the baseline level of distortion, as I said, every single instrument is distorted. It's all kind of smushed together. The mixing and mastering on a metal album typically is very dense, very wall of sound, almost like they're trying to make it as dense as possible. And I think in a lot of cases they are. That is the goal. And speaking of production, something that's really interesting is metalheads seem to, in general, have this idea that the music that they listen to isn't produced, overproduced like the mainstream pop music. You know, it's just real. And like as someone who's produced a lot of metal records and attempted to produce, like, you know, I'm pushing poppy. I haven't just actually made a pop record myself. Made some poppy-ish music, but the reason that I don't make pop is because I can't make pop because I am not that talented or that skilled. Uh, it's tough to have a balance to make music that sounds good when it's that stripped down and to know where every single element goes. There's way more margin of error in metal because you can throw a lot of shit in there that doesn't need to be in there and it's just lost in the noise. But noise is what I'm coming back to because metal is probably one of the most processed genres of music, right? And I don't think people get that. That if you heard like all those, you know, the crazy mechanical, super fast drums, if you hear that in a room, it's not going to sound like that. It just, drums don't sound like that. And so even on your most stripped down natural sounding albums, they're using sample replacement, they're using quantization. Lately, they're probably not even using real guitar amps or real guitar cabs, and so you're getting rid of like the microphone that's up to a cab, right? And so, and hell, even if you're not using plugins, even if you're using all real everything, there's still so much processing, so much EQ gouging, so much compression that goes into making those individual instruments sound as fucking loud and huge as they do. And I think people get that mixed up with it being raw because it's noisy, yes, and it's loud, yes. But does that make it raw and unprocessed? Fuck no. That processing is building that, right? Even look at something, I use nails as an example. I think they're a really good example of just punchy, in your face, just super well done. Like, it's not strictly speaking the most generic sort of metal, but I view it as an extreme of aggression. Their albums are just a punch to the face. There is so much processing that goes into that. I watched behind the scene things on it, and they're talking about like the different EQ ranges of the guitars. You know, the low end has to sound like this, the middle has to sound super tight and laser focused, the high end can sound like fizzy or whatever, and like so much processing goes into making an album that sounds unfiltered and raw. And you know, you've got, it's like, okay, well, they've got all this feedback and all this like squealing and stuff, and it's like, yeah, that they recorded on a dedicated intentional track, right? Like all of these choices that sound improvisational and just kind of ballsy and out there, it's all a decision in the process, which means that it's processed. They're all intentional decisions, right? And with pop music, if you're hearing an instrument, that's more or less what the instrument sounds like. When you hear fucking Taylor Swift's vocals, that's just what she sounds like because there's nothing to hide behind. And like her instrumentation, I'm sure they edit it a bit and I'm sure it gets EQ'd, but from beginning point to end point on a soloed instrument, you would be able to hear the resemblance a lot more in a pop record than you would on a metal record. The drums from start to finish are almost unrecognizably different. And that doesn't make it bad, but it does make it not more real music because it is just objectively more processed. The thing that I think people don't get about processing and like plugins and effects and that sort of thing is the more you add to it, the less real it's gonna sound. So like, and synths is a whole other thing. I can talk about that, but we're not talking about synths. We're talking about real instruments that people are playing or singing. The more shit you put in between the person singing at the microphone and the final product is things that make that signal sound less good. And that's not to say it's not processed. You're gonna throw like if you're in a studio recording vocals with a microphone, you're gonna have a preamp and you're gonna throw through an EQ or two, and you're gonna have a compressor or two. But that's it, really. That's all you need if you have a good mic and a good singer. And then if you start adding, oh, I'm gonna add this deboxing plugin. It's like what? And then like this de-esser. It's like, but if you just set the compressor right, you wouldn't need a de-esser. Oh, I'm gonna add the stereo widening thing, and I'm gonna add an exciter. And it's like, okay, that's fine. It might not even sound bad, but it's not going to sound as genuine. And again, I'm not like a super production expert. I don't know how they really do it in the studios. From what I've heard of Taylor Swift, I would bet that there isn't much more on her voice in a normal song than a preamp, an EQ or two, compressor or two. Like, I don't hear anything more. And maybe I'm just wrong. I don't know. Like, I'm not an expert. As I'm sure you gathered, I wear a lot of hats and I do a whole bunch of different things adequately. That is the pat on the back I'll give myself. I do a lot of things and I don't excel at any one of them. So that's just my best guess for production, because if you've heard my mixes, you know I'm not fucking Grammy nominated whatever. They pass. They pass the test of is it listenable. So fine. Yeah, but that is a weird thing when I have to once again separate the metal and the metal people from normal music. Is one, because they feel like it's this raw, visceral, noisy expression, and sure, it's noisy and it could be visceral, but it's definitely not like more real than pop music. Pop music isn't more fake and more processed. Like guarantee metal is more processed. And like 9 times out of 10, hell, 19 times out of 20, that album is going to have way more shit on the instruments just to keep it up with the current meta for metal albums. And we're not even talking about like metalcore and gent, by the way. We're talking about pull at random like a death metal or a melodic death metal album, because when we're getting into metalcore and gent, it's not even a contest. To my boomer ears, it's not even music. It's just computers. Because then we're talking about, okay, drums are fully sampled and we're not even giving a shit if anyone can play it. It's just a computer and we're not even pretending it's not. Guitars are all sampled using like signal change that are physically impossible. Sure, why the hell not? Bass, of course, has like it's split off. You've got like the double, and it's fine if you use the double, the high and the low thing, um, making it just sound like it both has all the low end, but then all the presence of a guitar too, and just like all the compression thrown in there, and then all the editing and the quantizing, bringing everything to the grid. You know, you chop up all the guitars and have them note for note on the grid, and then have all their muting, like you cut off the tail end so that it's like dead silent in between the chugs, and it's like no one on a pop record is doing that to any instrument. They're just not. And again, I'm not comparing just gent to pop because I feel like you have to be dumb to listen to that and be like, this is a raw, noisy expression. Like, no, it sounds like fucking computer music. And it's not bad, but that's not even what we're talking about. We're just talking about like a generic, like, not even Dark Tranquility. We're talking about like an Insomnium record, sure. Just as like our kind of baseline sample, um, for like modern metal. I could say Trivium, they kind of do have like a raw production. I think they're still using real caps, and real drums, but they're sample replaced for sure. And if you heard the drummer do that, it wouldn't sound like how it sounds on the album, even though the album isn't like turbo polished or anything. Um, yeah, but it's another thing that metalheads seem to use to gatekeep normal people out of listening to their music. Oh, that super processed pop music. And it's like, well, no, not compared to what you listen to anyway. And so I have to treat it as an exception in that regard, because if you're just making like a normal ass rock album, just like straightforward whatever contemporary rock, it's not even that polished or like modified. Like it is probably more so than a pop record, again, just from what I hear, from what I listen to. um but it's not as insane as metal. Like metal something else. um and the last one, which is in recent years sort of less of a thing, is this idea that like metal is super subversive and edgy because of the dark lyric themes. And like that was true in the 90s and 2000s when they were trying to scare all the fucking Christian moms and whatever. I don't even know if that factors anymore. I don't think that it's particularly edgier than like whatever you're hearing from like modern like rap music, drill especially. Um, yeah, trap music, whatever. It's different, but like not even really. Some of the stuff that I've been finding, the witch house and the goth trap stuff, I really like. Some dark lyric themes there. Like I don't think they'd be afraid to cover anything that metal isn't or is. Like I think it would have been more of a point 15 years ago. I don't think metal is really touching on anything like super edgy. And I do think that it's more interesting when it's not. I think it's more interesting when they're just writing albums about whatever, about emotional stuff, and they're not trying to be super edgy. That's just me, obviously. I'm a melodic death metal douche. Yeah, so just some stuff to talk about. I won't ramble on for too long. I'm gonna try to keep these videos somewhat short, so they're at least vaguely watchable. But that's today's thought. As usual, I said I was gonna talk about a thing, then I forgot to talk about a thing, and that thing was synthesizers. Um, when I said that whole thing about how the amount of plugins between the source and the final product makes it sound less real and less natural. That is true, but you can get away with a hell of a lot more with synth. Um, because even like the filters and the processing that even come just on the synth itself, how do I explain this? Like for most synthesizers, the sound is very pure because the waveform is very, very simple. It's not complicated like a real instrument. The waveform you look like on a real instrument, it's like super complicated. It's all whatever. You look at a synth and it's just like gonna be a woo, or it's gonna be like a square wave, or it's gonna be like a triangle, and like you can modulate it a bit, but like the core wave shape is gonna be really simple, and it means that it's a very pure, very clean sound. And so as you process it, you're going to color it. And you kind of want there to be that grit and those imperfections. And so you can EQ gouge the shit out of it, and it's not going to sound particularly unnatural because it's already a synth and it already sounds unnatural. Um, but I think you have to really not understand music to listen to pop music with a synthesizer and be like, this is overprocessed. Because lots of pop records are just using 80s synths and there's like nothing on them. They just plug them in and record them. There's probably like some EQ and, whatever. Um, yeah. I think the furthest you'd have to go to really make that argument is like dubstep, where like it's got to a point where the core sound that you're starting with doesn't even matter because of the amount of processing on top of it to make it sound as fucking bright and shrill and massive and stereo spread and plasticky as it does. Yeah, if you watched like Eliminate on YouTube, he can start with literally any sound and turn it into a dubstep song that sounds like a normal produced dubstep song. And it's because all of those plugins associated with FL Studio have this effect of like audio, what do you call it, like an audio exciter. Like it fizzes up the high end, it makes it super bright and super plasticky sounding. And same with like, yeah, the compressor, that OTT or whatever, like that's a thing that's pretty punchy. But even the reverbs and stuff that they use, they're very, I don't want to say dry, but they're bright. They're super fucking bright. I swear, like everything in FL Studio is skewed in a way that makes the sound bright and crisp and huge and present. Always just like upping the presence, because that's what that music sounds like. It sounds very bright and plasticky and like super super presence. Um, all that to say, yes, in terms of that sort of thing, there's a shit ton of processing on it, but I still don't think that the point is valid because you're still starting from a synthesizer, and the end result is still a synthesizer. And it's kind of not really the same thing. I don't think it's the same thing as starting with like a room full of drums and then ending on what passes as metal production now and being like, those are both drums. Like, yes, the word you would use is still drums, but you can't really replicate it, I guess you would say. It's because when we're talking about synthesizers, there's no starting goal of how it should sound. It's just pure sound design pulled from the void, right? Whereas drums, you've got a reference. You've got the actual kit in a room that someone ostensibly played. And so if no one's playing it and we're not pretending that they are, then sure, the drums can sound like whatever the fuck they want. And I guess based on my argument, you could argue that, oh, well, they're not super processed because they started out like that. And it's like, okay, fair point. I guess using that specific argument, Gent really isn't that much more processed because the sample library that you're downloading that's pre-blown out and pre-super mid-scooped and super present boosted, that starting point to ending point is probably about as much processing as a pop record because everything's already pre processed to shit. And I guess that argument would stand with like dubstep or something. But like for normal pop music, if you're hearing a synthesizer, like it's just gonna sound like a synthesizer. I don't really think you can make the argument that it sounds like any less musical because it's processed, because you can do whatever you want to process or to a synthesizer and it still sounds fine. I'm fucking up words. I'm gonna go.